Chapter 3. The Murder of Stephen Bove. On February 23, 1951, gunshots echoed along the bricked streets of Gowanus. A body, its head ruined by an up-close and personal pumping of lead, was rolled like a sack of garbage into a frozen gutter near the Carroll Street Bridge. On January 9, 1951, Carmine Persico, now 17 years old, was returning on foot from the movies to his home on Carroll Street, walking with his 20-year-old brother Alphonse. They walked on icy sidewalks, and later said they had just seen a double feature on Court Street, Where Danger Lives with Robert Mitchum and Mr. Lucky with Cary Grant. The brothers had almost made it home when three young men sprang from a nearby parked car. One said, "There they are." Another pulled a gun and fired twice, striking Carmine once in each leg. The hit team scrambled back into the car and laid rubber out of there, but they didn't get far. The driver careened wildly down the street and crashed into a parked car less than a block away. With the getaway car disabled, the shooter and his pals ran for it and disappeared into the night. The entire incident had been well contained in a small area. The attackers stole the car from a woman who lived just a few blocks up, also on Carroll Street. An ambulance was called, and Carmine went to the hospital. Alphonse was questioned by the police. He explained that he was just trying to be a good older brother. He knew that Carmine, just a kid really, look at him, was in that bad gang, Garfield boys, and he needed to stay on the straight and narrow if he was ever going to make something of himself. There'd already been trouble that led to tragedy. Alphonse said he was trying to talk Carmine into quitting the street life and spending more time on his studies. That was why they went to the movies. It was all part of Carmine's rehabilitation program. He said it with a straight face, too. Cops had to admire him for that. No worries. Carmine saw who shot him. It was Steve Bove, the guy from the 1949 Coney Island arrest, already in his mid-20s but still hanging out. He lived over on 3rd Avenue, worked for the Maritime Commission as a dock sweeper, currently assigned to a Staten Island pier. He also had a record of 3 arrests and had twice been sent up by the state, once to Sing Sing, once Elmira. Cops went to the hospital to talk to the victim. They recognized the kid with the mug on him from the Prospect Park thing. You couldn't forget the face or the attitude. And Carmine never said a word to the police. He merely gazed upon his interrogators with an expression of mild distaste. Carmine's silence didn't completely stifle the investigation, however. The beef between the Persico brothers and Stephen Bove was well known. As doctors were still yanking lead from Carmine's lower extremities, cops brought Bove in, questioned him and let him go. Not enough evidence, blah, blah, blah. But it made no difference. Steve Bove didn't have long to live. Carmine had been in the papers before, of course, but with a bullet in each leg, Carmine made the headlines for the first time. His shooting sharing the banner of the Eagle with news of the Korean War battle at Wonju Gates, a plan to draft 18-year-old boys into the military, and the death of novelist Sinclair Lewis. On February 22, 1951, as Brooklyn buzzed over the LIU basketball point-shaving scandal, only a few feet from the scene of the previous year's rumble, winter maintenance guys in Prospect Park were in front of the boathouse, draining Swan Lake to repair a faulty valve. As the noisy machinery cranked away, sucking the water from the lake, it became apparent that there was something in there that didn't belong. The thing turned out to be the body of 17-year-old Thomas Manjove, who had lived at 5th Avenue and 30th Street, next to Greenwood Cemetery, all the way on the other side of Prospect Park and then some, and had been missing for about 1 month. The body had managed to avoid discovery because it had been trapped beneath the ice. The kid delivered telegrams for Western Union, had disappeared on Sunday morning on his way to Mass at St. Xavier, and had no known gang affiliation. But still, police didn't like the proximity. The story of the body in the lake made the papers in the New York area, of course, but it also went national because, coincidentally we are told, the boy's kid sister was picnicking at the lake with relatives in the mud and blustery February wind when the body was discovered. She reportedly screamed, "That's my brother." It was the boathouse's second death in less than a year. Post-mortem said the death was by drowning. No evidence of foul play. The kid probably fell through the ice. Cops closed the case. The family screamed. Tommy was an excellent swimmer. How can we be sure Tom wasn't slugged? His older brother Frank said. Frank looked it up. The lake hadn't even been frozen when Tom disappeared. He'd seen the body. The face was all bruised. Significantly, he said Tommy always carried money, and none was found on his body. The night after Mangiovi's body was discovered, February 23, 1951, Carmine and Alphonse Persico were riding in a car with Steve Bove, who was very inebriated following copious drinks in a Red Hook saloon. Driving the car was a well-known thoroughbred racehorse jockey named Albert the Blue Beetle Grillo. We don't know how the evening got started or at what stage in the drinking the Persico brothers showed up. It's hard to imagine Bove agreeing to sit down with Alphonse and Carmine for a cocktail or 12. He must have known they were not his friends. Perhaps Bove had been drinking with Grillo and the Persicos arrived at the last moment, just in time for the car ride. Maybe Bove had been drinking with others, and his state of extreme inebriation struck the Persicos as an excellent opportunity to get the job done without much fuss. The jockey at the wheel, Grillo, worked at all the top tracks, including Belmont Park, an aqueduct racecourse in New York City, and Monmouth Park in New Jersey. Who sat where in the car is a matter of speculation, as there have been intimations that the official version of the night's events were altered. According to the official story, Carmine sat shotgun and kept a close eye on the diminutive driver. Alley Boy was in the back seat with Bove. There was one other passenger, presumably also in the back, who has never been publicly identified. The car worked its way through the sooty dark streets near the Gowanus Canal. They drove slowly through the industrial lowlands, deserted at that hour. The only sound was the car's tires, singing over the brick street. At one point, Alphonse calmly pulled a snub-nosed police special from his pocket, pointed it at Bove's head, and shot him 5 times. Grillo jumped so high his head almost hit the roof. Alley Boy ordered the terrified jockey to pull to the curb and stop the car. Carmine gave the Beetle a look that said everything. Do as you're told or you're next. The jockey did as he was told, and Alphonse rolled Bove's body into the gutter, only yards from the Carroll Street Bridge, crossing the fetid canal. Bove's gruesome remains were found later that morning by an unfortunate pedestrian. Cops tried to reconstruct the victim's last hours. As far as they could tell, Bove had last been seen in a neighborhood gin mill engaging in a drinking bout with some friends. It was unclear who the friends were, but the guy Bove left with was on the puny side. The body was autopsied by Dr. George W. Ruger, Assistant Kings County Medical Examiner in the county morgue. The bullets that killed Bove came from a .38. 4 shots had entered the back of Bove's head, and a 5th bullet struck Bove a glancing blow in the back. All 5 slugs were recovered, 4 still inside the body, and a 5th in the gutter under his body, where it was found. Toxicology tests confirmed that the deceased had been drinking heavily at the time of his death. Of special interest to investigators was the 28-year-old jockey, Anthony Blue Beetle Grillo, who was suspected of being the small fellow seen exiting the bar with Bove. Investigators struck pay dirt when they took a quick look at Grillo's car, which was a mess. A search warrant was quickly obtained, and the evidence, much of it once part of Bove's head, was confiscated, bagged, and sealed. They had Grillo red-handed. Cops made like they would pin the murder on Grillo if he didn't spill, and eventually the jockey gave up the Persicos. Police went in search of Alphonse and Carmine, only to discover that all of their friends and loved ones shrugged their shoulders and said they had no idea where they were. Everyone was deaf and dumb. But the law had its ways. People close to the brothers were tailed. Places they frequented were staked out. During the early hours of March 2, 1951, Carmine was found, arrested, and charged with Bove's murder, his second arrest in connection with the murder. Carmine clamped his lips together and asked for a lawyer. The lawyer subsequently explained to prosecutors that there was an outside chance that Carmine might have seen the murder, but no one, not even the investigation's key witness, said that Carmine heard anybody that night. The murder charge against Carmine was dismissed by Magistrate James A. Blanchfield in felony court on March 9. But Carmine continued to be held as a material witness in county court. Bail set at $50,000, a big number for a 17-year-old. As of March 10, Alphonse was still missing. The police went to the public. It was announced in the papers that they were on the lookout for Alphonse Persico, suspected of being the gunman in the death of Steve Bove. Alphonse, they explained, had disappeared. Carmine kept mum. Cops pored over Alphonse's car, which they found in a Carroll Street parking lot. Alphonse, investigators said, was the killer. Carmine, as far as they knew, was just tagging along. Details of Alphonse Persico's arrest are lost in the mist of time. When we next see Alley Boy, he has been captured, charged with Bove's murder, and thrown into a septic tank called the Raymond Street Jail. Carmine, in turn, was released. As was true during the Prospect Park murder trial, Carmine haunted the Kings County courtroom during his brother's trial, and again paid rapt attention to the figures that made the theater of so-called justice so compelling. His attention was even more focused than it had been at the Prospect Park trial. His active mind dug past the showmanship to the inner workings behind the scenes. It seemed to Carmine like the fate of the defendant hinged largely on the tenacity of his defense attorney. Alley Boy's guy was good, fought hard, but came off as tepid. Defenders should fight for their clients' lives as if they were their own. But that wasn't how it was. Carmine had seen the prosecutor and defense attorney standing in the hall, on the stairs, smoking together, complaining about the goddamned heat, talking about what they were going to have for lunch. It was just a job to them. Carmine felt that, should he ever get the opportunity, he could outduel any lawyer, not with smarts, but with heart. The Prospect Park trial had been intensely dramatic. Carmine would never forget the way the room felt when Senatore began to drill into the causes of juvenile delinquency. But there was something small about that trial when compared to Alley Boy's. Now up on that lofty bench was the Honorable Nathan R. Sobel, a 45-year-old legal scholar. Judge Sobel was born on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, but grew up in the Borough Park and Bronzeville sections of Brooklyn, went to Boys High School, boxed for a while in the 1920s, and put himself through Brooklyn Law School by working as a telephone operator at a Wall Street firm for $4 an hour. Before World War II, he counseled New York's Governor Herbert H. Lehman regarding a new workmen's compensation bill, and at the time of Alphonse's trial had been a Kings County court judge for 7.5 years. But all of that understates his public persona. He was society, the equivalent of a rock star, and had many showbiz friends like actor Edward G. Robinson and the songwriting team of Rodgers and Hart. In his robe, he radiated pure Brooklyn. Sitting beside Alphonse was 57-year-old Leo H. Healy, who in 1911 had held the title of World Champion Intercollegiate Orator, defeating the German Karl Guggenheim in the finals. It's hard to gauge the size of the talent pool for a competition like that, but it's safe to say that Healy could speak with great articulation. He was the valedictorian of his class at Fordham Law in the Bronx. Healy, back when he was a young man in the early 1920s, earned fame for combating the Black Star Line, African-American leader Marcus Garvey's attempt to set up a Pan-African economy. Healy started out as a kid from Boston, but married a Brooklyn girl and had lived there for decades. It was a bit of a fall for him that he now defended gangsters for a living, but his career had not been without hiccups. In 1930, when he was a judge, he was charged with a job-buying scheme. He was cleared of the charges, but resigned for health reasons. Despite the scandal that seemed to have derailed him as a judge, the fact that Sobel was presiding, and that Healy was defending, indicated to the press that this murder one case was special. The people were represented by Assistant District Attorney John E. Cohn, Chief of the Homicide Division and in charge of the County Court Division of the Brooklyn DA's office. He was born in Brooklyn and received his law degree at St. John's. As with Anthony Scarpati's trial, a blue-ribbon jury was to be selected, a jury consisting of highly qualified persons. It was code for no women. Board reporters doodled in their notepads during several days of voir dire. There was no air conditioning in the county courtroom, and the air was close with the sour scent of men in soggy suits. Out of an initial panel of 75 Venari men summoned on Monday, July 16, many felt Red Hook hoods deserved what they got. Others had misgivings about standing in judgment of someone who might have connections. Only a few felt they could be impartial. As fans blew the steamy air around, 8 men were impaneled in the first week. A fresh batch of 75 were brought in on July 23, and jury selection was completed. The hellish heat was tough on everyone in the courtroom except Alphonse, who found it far more comfortable than his nighttime accommodations. Since his arrest and during the trial, Alphonse made his home in a poorly lit dungeon that reeked of an unholy combo of urine, shit, puke, BO, and mildew. There had been a jail, always a hellhole on that spot on Raymond Street since 1836, although the current building was constructed in 1909. It was designed like a West Point fortress, the emphasis so security-conscious that the builders finished construction and realized they forgot to put in the front door. It had to be cut in later. There were maybe places in America where jail time was preferable to prison time. Cleaner, safer, more humane, where Aunt Bee brought over a hot supper. But not in Brooklyn in 1951. The Raymond Street Jail remained in operation until 1963. Don't try to find Raymond Street on a map. It has long since had its name changed to Ashland Place. The location is at the corner of Ashland Place and Willoughby Street. A medical building stands there, and the current jail, called the Brooklyn House of Detention for Men, is on Atlantic Avenue. Alphonse's trial was scheduled to start in the furnace, but to almost everyone's relief was delayed a month because the medical examiner left on vacation. By the time opening statements were made and the people began calling witnesses to the stand, the heat had broken. That was the summer that the Dodgers seemed assured of winning the National League pennant. During jury selection, the team was cruising toward a championship. By the time the trial began, those dreams were shattered. The New York Giants of Manhattan stole the pennant on the last day of the season in the Polo Grounds behind Bobby Thompson's shot-heard-around-the-world home run off our beloved pitcher Ralph Branca. The highlight of Alphonse Persico's trial was the testimony of the Blue Beetle himself. A courtroom journalist wrote that Alphonse swallowed hard when hearing Grillo's damning testimony. Grillo said the party had started at a tavern and then into the car. Your car? Yes, sir. Who was driving? I was. How many were in the car altogether? 5. Alphonse Persico and Bove were in the back seat. Grillo was not asked and did not name the other people in the car. And why were you together? We'd been out drinking at a joint at 8th Street and 3rd Avenue. Then you left together? Yes. At what point did you look back into the back seat? After the first shot? And you saw Mr. Persico shooting Mr. Bove. I saw Bove slumped over and Persico pointing a gun at him. Then I saw him shoot him. How many times? 4 more times. He emptied his revolver into him. Why didn't you stop the car? Persico threatened me. He told me I drove where he told me to drive or he'd kill me too. Where did he tell you to drive? To Carroll Street. What if anything happened on Carroll Street? He told me to stop the car so we could throw out the body. And that was what happened? Yes. When the body was out, he closed the door and told me to drive him home. They were already on the Persico Street. He only had to drive a few blocks up the slope to drop them off. That sort of testimony was difficult to impeach. Alphonse and his counsel, Leo Healy, could read the writing on the wall. The jury would never deliberate as, on Tuesday, August 7, Allie Boy and Healy took a deal, pleading guilty to second-degree murder. Judge Sobel asked Alphonse, You admit firing the shots that killed Bove? Yes. You understand that calls for a mandatory sentence of 20 years to life? Alphonse nodded. The judge said, Let the record show Mr. Persico answered in the affirmative. Healy addressed the judge briefly. I would request, Your Honor, that the sentencing be delayed a month as Mrs. Persico is due to have a child in that time. Many in the courtroom were struck by this news. It was one thing to be reckless with your life and play shoot-'em-up cowboys in the streets, but to do it while your wife was pregnant? And it wasn't even for a piece of the pie. What did Alphonse get out of the killing? Revenge, that was it. The judge pondered the request for a delay. It will take that long to make a probation report anyway, Judge Sobel replied. The official sentencing was delayed and Alphonse was led away, the delay buying him an extra 30 days at the Raymond Street Jail, where rats, both human and rodent, skittered during the inky night. From there he'd moved to prison. By the time he was released, his kid brother would be a very big man in Brooklyn, an alley boy, like Anthony Scarpati before him, had a job waiting for him. Some may wonder how the Blue Beetle managed to survive after testifying for Alphonse's prosecution, and he did. For quite a while. He put Alphonse behind bars, and yet he lived, and not on the down low either. Guys that worked in or around horse racing had to fuck up repeatedly to get whacked. Simple fact. They were worth far more alive than dead. The Beetle was a jockey and in a position to be a fantastic earner. Years later, we knew the Beetle. He was partners with our pal Tarzan in a joint on 9th Street and 3rd Avenue called the Blue Beetle. The same Tarzan that did the cooking for my pal Mondo and his mom in their club on President Street. Tarzan was Johnny Lusterino, a kid from Hull Street in Bed-Stuy. He'd come up through the gangs, as had Carmine, and knew the inside of police stations and courtrooms before he turned 17. He once did a lengthy prison stint for stealing furs. When I was a kid, the President Street boys went to Tarzan's place often. When war broke out, it was Tarzan who came to President Street and cooked while the crew hit the mattresses. He was there to do more than cook, though, and always let it be known that he and his gun were available for assignment. In 1972, Tarzan was kidnapped after visiting his mother and never seen again. The Beetle was well liked. He may have testified, but most people understood the tough position he was in. He wasn't in on the hit on Bove at all. He was an innocent. Why should he do time for that? Then again, the Beatles' style irked some guys. He should at least be grateful he was alive and show a little humility. Sometimes it almost seemed like he was exploiting the fact that he hadn't been whacked in retaliation. He was always doing something to draw attention to himself, asking for it. No bullets came, yet. But Grillo ran into a streak of bad luck. In the spring of 1953, he was playing dice on the corner of Garfield and 5th, home of the Garfield boys. There was a pile of money right on the sidewalk. A group of grown men gathered tightly around the cutter, who apparently hadn't greased the flatfoots the way he was supposed to. While one threw dice, another laid odds, faded betters, and raked in cash. Some of the shooters may have been kneeling, but you could tell it wasn't a prayer meeting. There was tension. The guy who hadn't paid the law must have known there was the risk of an interruption. Sure enough, 2 cop cars arrived simultaneously, one on 5th, one on Garfield, and cops came from all sides. Some ran, some fought. In the resulting melee, Grillo, who though not large was a professional athlete, grabbed an officer's nightstick and broke it over the cop's head. In 1955, years after Bove's murder, the New York Racing Commission banned Grillo from racing in New York State, not because he'd assaulted a police officer, but because he had admitted to driving a car in which one guy shot another. So Grillo went west and rode at Santa Anita in California, where, according to historian William J. Mahoney, races were fixed so that track regular J. Edgar Hoover could win. Grillo thrived in Southern California. It took a long time, but Grillo eventually crossed life's finish line in a violent manner. He'd been living in California for years, but returned east to see his brother Frank. His little jockey body was found dead on December 29, 1968, on the floor of the Oceanside Boys Club on Long Island with 4 bullet holes in him. Police said it looked like there might have been a card game involved. On President Street, word was that Alley Boy had ordered the hit. The Beatles' earning days were through, so it was time to pull the plug.